Welcome to another episode of the Surfcast Podcast. We've got a special guest on tap this week. A lot of you know him already, but we're going to try to talk about something a little bit different to a degree that I think he's covered before, at least on some of the podcasts and videos. We've got Rhode Island fishing legend Dennis DZ Zambrotta. So, Dennis, thank you very much for hopping on the podcast with us this week.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you were high up on our list originally when Jerry and I were setting us up with it. We got to have Dennis on. We got to have him on. We wanted to do something with you in the fall because of your legendary stories out on Block Island. But we kind of want to do something a little different because you're so synonymous with the needlefish, Block Island, the snowstorm blitz, which is, I mean, I could hear you tell that story a million more times and be on the edge of my seat just as much as I was the first time I heard it. But we're gonna go a little different, I'd say. I mean, I'm sure you've talked about this before, but we're talking the red fin. It's going to be the primary subject here. Obviously, some Block Island, some current fishing, things like that. But we're going to deep dive the red fin this week.
that's right. And before we get into that topic, though, I want to encourage everyone to check out both of Dennis's books. Dennis, do you want to give us the precision titles and where they could get these books?
Oh, yeah. Surfcasting Around the Block was my original book, produced in 2012 or published in 2012. And my second book in 2022 was Surfcasting Around the Block 2. I know it's hard to remember those two names, but um, and right now the older book, Surfcasting Around the Block, is available either on Amazon or available at Saltwater Edge or Block Island Bookstore. The second book right now, the print copies are all out. I'm getting ready to print some more, but the Kindle copy of that is available um, through Amazon, and there are hard copies available through Saltwater Edge.
Cool. That's great.
We'll put those links on the YouTube from on our website in the description on the podcast and everything, so people will be able to check that out and get over directly. Like I said, I highly recommend both books. They're excellent news. I'm kind of surprised that the first edition or the first one has been around now that long. It seems like it didn't seem that long ago when it first came out. But I love both of them. I still try to read that every year. It's in my annual readings, and I added the second one in for sure.
Yeah, cool. And
Thank you.
Dennis, you were just, we're recording this at the beginning of November. You were just on Block Island, in fact. How did that go?
Oh, yeah. I always love fishing Block Island, but catching is not always the best. This trip was a real grind. And I was a little discouraged because the last 3 years in the fall, I usually go over there anytime from the third week of October through maybe Veterans Day. You know, I'll pick a week in that area and I'll go out to Block. And like I said, the last 3 years have been very encouraging for me. After a very dismal period of about 10 years before that. But this year, it went right back to the grind, and I fished pretty hard, 2 sessions a day, 7 days. I got 8 striped bass
Wow. Wow.
total.
That is definitely a grind. Was there anything notable before I ask you about the fishery, because I want to get a little bit of your perspective there too? Was there anything notable besides just the lack of fish on the island this
Well,
year? Like if you put in your log, 2024 Block Island, this trip will be known for this. Was there one or two things?
well, I mean, I tend to want to go over there on a dark moon, and whenever that lines up for me with that time period that I go, I think I'm in pretty good shape. And I was there during a new moon week. The the island is surrounded with bait. So forage is not or was not an issue, where sometimes that is the issue.
Okay.
And the forage there is plenty to eat out there. The body of predator fish is what's missing.
Interesting. So not to maybe move us off of it so quickly, but I'm really interested to know. You've noted that it's really hasn't been good for a long time, but it was maybe good more recently, and that it's sort of taken the dive again. And I think actually a lot of us may even say that about other places than Block, that we had a little bit of hope, and then this year has been brutal. What's your perspective on the fishery? You know, what do you see? What do you hope? What do you think? And that's a super open-ended question, and I'll let you answer it however you want. We just haven't really had a chance to ask anybody on yet. And with you, with so much history and so much experience, I'd really be interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, the thing is I lived through and fished through the last crash, which was basically the early 1980s, and the recovery. But back then, I mean, I really had no perspective on how cyclic it was. Because that was my first one. That was my first, like, where did these fish go? And you got to remember back then, I mean, the information environment was not as rich as it is nowadays.
Right.
So now I'm able to kind of live through a second one. And I'm seeing similarities, and most notably, 8, 10 years ago, I was seeing like tons and tons and tons of very, very small fish. Like the late falls just got to, even on Block, it just got to be like you'd go out there and you would be hard pressed to catch anything over 5 pounds. And even in Newport, my local waters in Newport. And I was like, wow, this is like, boy, there's a lot of little fish. And it kept going and kept going. Every fall, there was little fish, but there was nothing larger. And I'm like, eventually these things have to get bigger. But I wasn't seeing the progression in my falls until about 3 years ago on Block Island. And then all of a sudden, I'm like starting to see, oh, these fish are now just below slot, in the slot, or well over slot. And I'm like, now these fish are now becoming fun to catch on a 10-foot rod with a 250. I mean,
Right.
I'm happy catching that size fish, even though they might not be the monsters I want. They are fun fish to catch,
right,
and release. And but now that's all I'm starting to see. There's very, very few of those millions and millions of small ones from 8 years ago are gone. That's the same thing that happened back in the 80s. Everything was big, and little ones were like unicorns. They were like, what happened to the little fish? Like every spring, there was always that run of small fish. And back in this, in the 80s, they were not there anymore. Everything we were catching was 15 pounds and up, even in Newport. We didn't know it at the time, but eventually scientists started to say, hey, there's a big gap in the biomass here. You've got a few breeders left that are our only hope because there's nothing else coming up the pipeline. And that's scary. And I think there's a little bit of that nowadays. The big different wild card with it is back then we didn't have the electronics and stuff that we had now, like, because you can get completely different perspectives from like guys that are, the fleet of charter boats are able to nowadays, like, oh, there's not a problem with the fishery. Look at all these fish on my scope.
yeah.
Back then you had depth finders on your boats. You might be able to get a
Paper
mark or
charts.
two, but
That's right. If there's 10 fish left, they'll motor around with the side scan until they find those 10 fish, and then say, well, there's still 10 fish until,
yeah. So, I mean, that's the perspective that I'm looking at it with. I'm a little concerned.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'm more than a little concerned.
Yeah. Before we move into the redfin, I just have to comment. What you just described is honestly so similar to my experience on the Cape Sand beaches. I can't even believe it. I had not really actually even thought about it quite so much until you just started explaining it. And I'm like, oh my God, he's explaining my experience. Now, there's some disclaimers there I don't want to get into, but it's so similar. You know, the size progression, the timeline, the 10 years in the last 3 years and then this year, it's it's more than a little spooky. I don't like it. I don't like that, Dennis. I don't like it. So, but
Me neither. I don't have much time left, man.
yeah, no, I mean, yeah, that's
Physically,
yeah,
I mean, I don't know how much, longer I'm going to be able to physically uh, pound this out because it takes a toll on me,
yeah,
stamina wise.
yeah. Surf fishing is super hard.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
And
So
it makes it harder as the production drops off too. You
Oh,
feel
yeah.
those those slow nights make it feel even more. Even just in my age that I'm at, I'm feeling that more, and I've commented on it more times than I'd care to admit this year. That you feel those tougher nights a lot quicker and a lot harder now than.
Yeah. I mean, Monday Night Football and the World Series was able to take some of that pain away. I had something to escape to, like, oh, hey, we gave it 5 hours. I'm going to go home and watch the game. This is just like, what am I doing?
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, totally, totally.
Yeah.
Um, well, with that said, Toby, you want to transition us to the topic of the afternoon here, or evening, or
Yeah.
morning, whenever anyone's listening to this?
Yeah, right. So yeah, we're gonna do some redfin talk here now. Let's jump right into the meat of it. I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with the redfin. We'll primarily, unless we say so, we're pretty much talking the 7-inch redfin, but we do have some points here as we're gonna go along to discuss the 5-inch. But unless we specify otherwise, you can assume that 7-incher is the one that we're talking about. So.
Yeah.
I think probably the best place to start off is just asking Dennis, where did you start fishing the redfin? How did you hear about it? How did it come your way? How readily available was it in those early when you first got it? Meaning, did the tackle shops carry it? Was it a mail order? Was it somebody of yours just hooked you up? So how did it come into your vision in the surf?
Well, I was always a rebel fisherman. Um, and the Rebel Super Minnow and both sizes, the F80 and the F90. I mean, that was in the 70s. That was, when I started fishing, that was the plug to use. That was the minnow swimmer that was like everybody used it. The Cape, down in New York, down in Jersey, everybody fished the Rebel. And it was the minnow swimmer to have. Somewhere in the 1970s, Cotton Cordell um, started to kind of those lures, which are marketed to freshwater, even the Rebels. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think the saltwater market is a very small, minute secondary market for Rebel and for Cotton Cordell for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So some of those, people are going to experiment. People are going to see them in a tackle shop. They're going to buy them. I started to learn about the Cotton Cordell Red Fin in the very early 1980s. Um, and and it was kind of like word of mouth a little bit. People would talk like, "Hey, have you tried a redfin?" And like, "What's a redfin?" And then uh, the Fisherman magazine, guys, people, Toby, you know this. People wrote about stuff, new stuff, people that were willing to kind of experiment and try to blaze a new trail and try something different, something new. We're starting to use the Redfin. And then my buddy Zeke gave me a copy of the Surfcaster catalog. And sure as shit, it was in the catalog too. And I'm like, whoa. I said, maybe there's something to this. You know, it's a very similar experience with the needlefish back in the old days. I mean, nobody used it, but then somebody did, and then word really got out. But
And
anyway,
everybody did.
yeah. So the redfin, I first started to play around with the smaller sizes, um, and I quickly learned that they were really good during sandio bites, and but the rebels were still my baby, Um, but little by little, we started learning a little bit more about it. Fishermen articles about loading the big one with water. Um, and then again, the Surfcaster cataloging, putting it in there. I mean, I kind of did a little research before our talk. The first ones I bought were from the Surfcaster. It was $3.50, you know. And then, through Fisherman Magazine articles, I learned how to load them with water, things like that.
Gosh, actually, 350 is cheap, but man, they haven't really increased that much in that long
No,
of
Yeah,
time.
I was
It's still one of
after that.
it is still one of the best bargains in fishing.
Yeah, it really is. That's pretty wild. Do you remember, and this is putting you on the spot a bit, but do you remember like a watershed moment where you were, you heard the redfin was good and, you knew you should use it, you had some, but then all of a sudden there was like a gear clicked in, we were like, oh, a bite happened, we were like, oh. Or a couple of tides or a fall or a spring or something where you were all of a sudden you were like, oh, that's it.
I think I may have really started to catch fish with it. I checked my logs. I mean, I was using it in 81, but I checked my logs before this talk. And 84, we really started to transition to more redfin use from the rebels. I'm trying to remember why. I know, I know my buddy Zeke and I went to some of the outdoor fishing shows in the wintertime, and we would talk to like Pradco, which was plastics research and development company that put out Rebel, and we talked to the reps there, about Rebels, and uh, we thought we were hot shits, and we told the guy, hey, you better watch out for Cotton Cordell Red Fins. And the guy looked at us and smiled. He says, "We own them." And I'm like, he says, "We're not worried about it." He says, "We own." I said, "Well, what about we own Bomber?" They own them all. They bought them all up, and it was so weird because we thought we were such big shits. But anyway, yeah, 84 is when I really started to use it.
Do you remember
when I went to block is when I really started to learn the ins and outs of it. Hey, when you go on block, when the fishing's real good, pay attention to what you find washed up on beaches. I mean, the plugs that you find washed up on beaches, especially on block, I mean, uh, those were those were very, very productive plugs.
Yeah. So there's
You
a
know,
lot washing up is what you're saying.
if you find, 5 red fins and 5 needlefish and maybe 1 rapala, there's a reason for that.
In those early days, do you remember, I mean, maybe it wasn't 84, but do you remember a specific bite early on where you were like, the redfin is king and this is like, it's just trouncing everything else and this is just like a dynamite? Or maybe maybe you can't remember a super specific tide, but a few bites or a week or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that kind of made me transition to it. Was frustration with Rebel because we in Newport we kept breaking lips. We had to replace them all the time. So when my buddy and Zeke and I would fish, there was always like he'd be using a Rebel, I'd be using a Redfin, or vice versa. Just so we can compare notes. Because we were on the same area, and we're just kind of um, we were getting big fish on both, but Block Island on one specific night, I really, because everybody was using needlefish out there, and and I had kind of played around with the red fin and like realized like what its advantages were. And there was this I went into Southwest Point one night on block. I parked. There was only one other car there. It was howling Southwest. I mean, just cranking. And the bar was completely white. And this guy, he was a very notable Narragansett surfcaster, somebody I really respected, and I knew that person knows what they're doing. And I said, and I'm walking down the path, he's walking up, you know, and I just go, "What are you doing? Anything going on?" He goes, "No, nothing at all." He said, "It's so hard to fish." And he said, it's tough. And I'm going, oh, all right. I said, "Yeah, I'm here. I'm going to go give it." He says, "I'm going to go wherever he decided to go that night." And so I ran down. It was like dead low water. And I tried to throw my needlefish, and the belly in the line was so poor. I mean, it was blowing like crazy. It was all I could do. I could not gain any kind of uh, purchase with the needlefish. It must have just been skipping across the top of the water. And of course, you got to remember we're all using mono back then. And I go, "Wow, I know redfins, I can gain purchase in that water and kind of dig a little bit because it really looked good, you know, and low tide was often the time to be on that bar." And I put the redfin on, and oh my God, I caught so many big fish, and I'm all by myself. And I'm like, and that's all you needed. You needed something to be able to, you needed to present the profile in that water. And the needlefish was not the thing. But the fish were there, and all you had to do is throw this thing out and just reel it in very slowly, just so it would take out the belly. And when the line went tight, half the time you didn't feel the bite. When the line went tight, you just lift your rod tip up, and that was a fish. And it was just it was great. And that was a magic night for me with the redfin. I'm like, wow, this thing. There's a reason people talk about this in hushed tones. That there's reasons this works.
My question for you,
and that was probably my first real night. Like after that, I mean, there was a zillion redfins in my bag all the time, along with needlefish. So
my big question for you, of course,
yeah.
is that did you tell that guy? Did you tell that guy afterwards?
You know what? I may have, but it wasn't like our paths crossed that often. It was a strange groups of people and back then, and crews of people that you didn't often talk to each other unless you actually met each other.
Sure.
You know, walk by each other, you know, and then some would and some wouldn't. But other than that, you wouldn't like get on a phone or go knock on their door in the next cottage and say, "Hey, you know, you left the other night and I caught a shitload of fish." I don't think I'd ever do that to somebody.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. So something you said is a perfect transition to my next question. Toby, I'm jumping in here. Sorry. You said something like the advantages of the redfin, or I knew the advantages of the redfin. For someone who isn't fishing the redfin right now, of which there are many, because I think it's fair to say these days it is a Rhode Island staple, but outside of Rhode Island, the further you get away from Rhode Island, the less and less it's used, I think. Although Maine, I think actually it's probably more popular, but it feels like the further south you go, maybe. It's used everywhere, but it definitely is a very strong Rhode Island thing. For those not using it, so let's forget about the people who are using it and they're looking for more tips, but for those aren't using it, what are the advantages? What is the advantage of that 7-inch redfin? What makes it special?
Well, the advantages are, I mean, obviously, if you load it, you're going to get a very good casting plug. You're going to get something that can be fished in a crosswind You're going to get something that you could fish with the wind in your face. And then you're going to get something that can be fished in very heavy surf or very flat surf. It's versatile. Um, there's, you can play around with it with hook configurations to make it do different things. Uh, I mean, every alteration that you make to a plug is going to change it somewhat, you know.
But the
So I
red
mean,
fin is the
I've
red.
gone from two 4.0s, two 3.0s, a 4.0, and a 3.0. And I'm talking all trebles here. And I just play around with hooks for certain applications based on the conditions. But and it's also a plug. I mean, I worked at the Saltwater Edge um, a number of years ago, and people would come in and they'd be staring at the wall of plugs, and they would ask me like, and I can tell if they were fairly new to the game and they just wanted to go out and cast, and they were like asking me what was a plug that they could have success with, and I would always point to the red fins.
Mhm.
But they would ask me like, wait a minute, and like this is better than like this is like $7 and that other plug is 27. Like why would this one be better than that one? Of course, that's a tough. I mean, I was a terrible salesperson as far as getting like profit
Yeah,
or the
right.
stop because I'm looking at it as like, hey, no, I know it's going to sound weird. I said, but this is the plug I use. If you don't buy it, it's more fish for me. That's fine.
Now, I got a quick little jump in. So you got that person who's in, asks you that or kind of gets that, and you point to a red fin. Is there a color that you would be putting that person on to start?
Oh, well, bone was big, then.
Mhm.
I mean, that wasn't always the case with red fins. I mean, we can get into that history of color patterns too if you feel like it. But but the bone was like I would just like buy this, cast it out, reel it in really slow. It's going to wobble on the surface. You're not going to you're not going to hang it up. Again, I'm talking to basically like beginners.
Yeah.
You'd sell them a popper and a redfin, and then maybe a bucktail and a tin.
Yeah, that's right.
You just try to cover a few of the basic bases.
Hmm.
And but yeah, I mean the bone one was it. I mean the bone works daylight. I mean daytime, nighttime, middle of the day. That's the one I would put them on. Yeah.
You definitely opened the door. So now our listeners will be yelling at us if we don't say. So can you just give us a little bit of brief color history? What did you mean by that? Because I can hear him like, if we just keep going, they're going to be in the comments are just going to be all about this. So now we got it for sure.
Oh, yeah.
And then I'll go back to ask you about hook configurations. We'll do that after.
Yeah. All right. Well, colors. All right. Now you got to remember too, red fins when they were first developed, they had a rough finish. Okay. And then somewhere after Pradco acquired Cotton Cordell, they changed to a smooth finish. I'm not exactly what year that was, but anyway, the rough finish was like a crinkle. We called it the crinkled finish. And in the beginning, the color of choice back in the day, at least for us, was the chicken scratch or what Cotton Cordell called yellow striper.
Hmm.
So basically, it was a yellow back, and it had like it could be black or green dashes on the side, which kind of gave it the striped kind of look. And that was like very popular because we were used to fishing yellowback rebels. So, I mean, it stands to reason. Like yellowback rebels were like the hot color. Seems like yellow has got a great history in striped bass, plug usage, but darters, et cetera, But anyway, so the yellow striper was the one that we started out with, and It was our best producer. And then we started playing around with the chrome ones. And then many, many years later, people started to tell us like, you should spray paint these things all black. I mean, they did not offer them all black. Not at least that I knew. And, but yellow was the one. But then when they went smooth, we started to play around with the chrome ones, like blue back chrome finish, black back chrome finish. The problem with the chrome ones is they would chip. You know, that paint was very brittle, it would fall off. Well, if you had a beater plug, eventually that chrome plug would start to turn almost all white. And it was catching so many fish. And then we just said, you know what, let's just scrape this stuff off. So we created our own bone. Obviously, years and years later, you know, Cotton Cordell decided, like, hey, you know, just give it a basic plug, no paint on it, and it's going to catch. And thank God they did it, you know, because it ended up being, you know, for a while there, it was like a big seller, you know, locally.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of the history.
Yeah, that's good. So you mentioned that the plug is very versatile, and then without saying this exact word, what you were also saying, I think, is that it's very flexible, because you were talking about different hook configurations.
Yeah.
So before we get into the loading, which is probably requires a couple of sentences, I have heard you say various different hook riggings that you do. Can you give us a couple of examples of what you think someone should have, you know, if they've got to have a couple of red fins, how they should be rigged? Like, what are your favorites? How you would rig them based on how you fish?
Yeah. So basic fishing, if you're just going to use it for everyday conditions, not necessarily like storminess or anything like that, 2/3/0 trebles. I have experimented over the years with a flag and or with a single on the back, caught fish, but I've never really swayed, you know, too far from the 2 treble configuration. I know that's kind of like a little bit of a hot button topic nowadays, but so 2/3/0 are just basic all around conditions, you know, light and variable winds, not a big surf. Every once in a while, the fish are nudging your red fins and not taking aggressively. Sometimes I would go to a 1/4/0 in the forward and then a 3/0 in the back to give it a little bit more tail wiggle. Or at least I thought it was doing that, but the fish seemed to like turn onto it sometimes. And then if you're fishing big surf with a chance of really big fish, the 2/4/0 are what we use. You know, a loaded red fin with 2/4/0 hooks, added a little bit more extra casting weight to it. You were able to have those hooks hold up to some of the larger fish if you had a chance of hooking some good fish. I mean, on block, that's when we used it. We had 2/4/0, or at least I did. And just to be able to withstand the rigors of the size fish that we had back then. And in rough water and heavy winds, it cast a lot better, and it dug better. You know, again,
right.
a lot of our fishing is presenting a profile. If you don't present that profile in a strike zone, it's going to go unnoticed or ignored. So that's what I would do with the hooks, basically.
Now you mentioned the loading there as you were going through it. Pretty these days it seems like that's the standard. So many people that's all they know. They just fish the loaded version. Do you fish them interchangeably? Is it really just specific conditions you're bringing one for the other? You're trying to present a little different. Is there a reason why, on a given night would you pack, for instance, some unloaded and some loaded in your bag? Do you kind of go out knowing it's probably going to be this, so I want this? Is there a way you'd kind of decide that?
Toby, I don't use the unloadeds very often. Like a stock
Yeah.
out of the store. The few times I do use them per year are generally when it's flat calm. And generally when I'm fishing some shallow structure with some floating weed, possibly, bubbleweed fields at a certain stage of tide where you don't want that rebel to dig and crawling it along. So if a night is like that, and I know the fish have been finicky, which they tend to be sometimes on flat calm nights anyway, I will definitely put an unloaded redfin in the bag.
What's the hook configuration on that? Unloaded.
On that one, it would be 2 3/0.
Okay.
Yeah, 2 3/0. I know Timmy Coleman and Pat Abate spoke a long time ago about putting 1/0 on a redfin to keep it straight on top. I never experimented with that configuration. I mean, they had, triple X,
Yeah.
strong mustads and or eagle claws back then.
Yeah, the eagle claws, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was still running a pair of trebles on my red fins, I would do on the unload a lot of times. It was a 3/0 on the belly and a 2/0 on the back to give it stay right up, give it that extra kind of kick. And that was that's where I landed for the unload. It's a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean it's something that a caster can do. I mean, you can play around with hook configuration. The guys have been doing that with metal lips forever. I mean, I learned a lot from a New York charter skipper about how he would troll his Dannies on wire, and what the configuration was on those big 9-10 inch Dannies. Three trebles, and he'd have a big 5/0 and a 4/0 and a 3/0. I mean, it's just they wanted that thump on the end of that wire, and I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. Maybe he's doing basically the same thing we are, and so it's something that fishermen can use to their advantage. It just takes time to learn it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so this is November. We're recording this. This time of year, late in the year, I have some bites where I'll actually use them with a 2-0 on the front because I'm throwing them in extremely skinny, calm, crystal clear water where they're sand eels. And boy, the introduction of new, hyper strong hooks has been like the BKK Viper in a 2-0 is so strong. It's got a wide gap. So what a fantastic, and then there's nothing you can do to get that off the surface. So you can do all kinds of stuff with it and go as slow as you want, and it swims great. It's just fantastic. And that is one of the beautiful things about the plug, is that you can do all these things with just one plug, right? I mean, it's really amazing.
Right.
It really is.
Right.
And you almost within reason don't run the risk of ruining it. There's something about the redfin. I don't think I've ever put hooks on that was all right, this thing doesn't even swim anymore. It still has it still has a little bit of action and still looks just sexy enough. We're all right, this might work still.
Yeah, I mean, the only application I've ever used that never really produced for me was we all tried it, we just overloaded it. When we did load, we just said, hey, we're just going to fill this damn thing up and see if it worked. And I'm sure there's bass will eat anything. I'm sure there are going to be times when you can get something to bite it, but for most applications, it didn't seem to work.
So we're talking about loading a lot too. For those who want to load this plug, and not get too crazy with 5 different, we just gave them 3 or 4 or 5 different hook configurations. If they're just going to do one load, starting point, what are they going to do, Dennis?
You're going to load it with water, which is pretty much most of my fishing was, was loading with water. I mean, I played around with oils and BBs and, and I had acquired some Merc ones but loading with water was what I did myself. And, and the thing to remember is if you have a clear redfin or something that is opaque and you can put it up to a light and see inside it, you can load it to the stomach hook hanger. So you make a hole in between the eyes. The easiest way to make a hole is to heat a finished nail or a paper clip with in a candle, poke a hole through the head, have a little bit of a syringe with you that can hold about 10 cc's of water, and then load it with a syringe. And if you don't have a redfin that you can see through, in other words, it's painted and you can't see the water level, you load it with 10 cc's of water, which will put you around the stomach hook hanger. Okay, which is it's the basic, like the load that most people tended to use. And then you just melt that hole back. Now, if you don't have a syringe, you can keep moving that hole through a faucet of water, and eventually water goes in it, and just keep holding it up. And then once you get to that level, you're fine. If you get too much, just shake the head. And then what we would do then is we would take that, a finished nail or whatever we used to melt it, and we would then remelt the top of the head and close that hole, and then add a little bit of an epoxy. I mean, some people went to other great measures to not make it look like it's got a, scalp on on the top of the plug. But that's how we did it, and it was fine. And the thing to remember too is the water, if it may leak out depending on your hook hangers, or it may evaporate out. So you do have to, throughout the year, keep looking at it and maybe refilling it. A good way to find out if it's leaking is to hang it up from the nose down and leave it there with a little cup underneath it in your basement. And if it's leaking, you'll notice there'll be water in the cup.
And over the winter,
that's not good. Then you kind of have to. It's a tough process, and it doesn't happen with a lot of them. But you'll have to put some super glue around the tail connector.
Yeah. Over the winter, it's funny. You load them, and then over the winter, by the springtime, they're empty. That's what happens to me. And then you just have to reload them.
That's why I stopped with the water. Like I started using baby oil, or mineral oil. That was what I switched to, because the water would, like you said, it evaporates or something. Like it just would be gone. And at least with the oil, if it was leaking, it would put residue on the hangers, and you would know. It was like an easier signal for me, to say, okay, I got to check this one, see where it's at. And I mean, it made a mess. I remember some. Over the winter, plug bin full of just oil.
It does make a mess of your bag if it starts to leak in your bag. Like all of a sudden you'll be fishing. The few times I've used it and that happened, I'd grab a plug as I'm trying to switch a plug, and I'm like, what is this? It's dark. Everything is all greasy and slippery, and it's once the girl gets around, it's probably worse if you use pogie oil or something.
Well, I was just saying, I had a friend that actually loaded them with the bunker oil that you can buy.
Right.
His thought process was, well, they're going to leak a little eventually anyway, so it's now a little scent trail. I'm like, yeah, but it's going to leave that scent trail in your bag at night or in your plug bin over the winter in your truck. But that's what he used.
There, Toby, if that happens in your plug bag, if it's a sailcloth bag, you're never going to get that smell out.
No. Nope.
Yeah.
It is going to be in that bag forever.
Yep, that's right. Can I give a little tip for when you're filling? So you said going back and forth across the faucet.
Yeah.
If you've got a sprayer in your house and your kitchen faucet,
okay,
you can use one of the single streams coming out.
There you go.
And you line it up just with the hole, and the pressure's enough that it, you know, breaks the film that you have the trouble with when you're passing it back and forth.
Yeah, yeah.
And especially if you use it on high pressure, you can put it in there. You usually end up overfilling because you can't. It's hard to control, and then you just kind of shake it out, shake it
There you
out,
go.
shake it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's
That's a good
easy-
suggestion. Sure.
Yeah, that works really well. So versatile plug, hook configuration, loading. But I have to ask you. You've said, you know, it works here, it works there, it works everywhere. What is there like a night, a condition, a place, and I'm not talking about a specific spot, but like a structure where you're like, this is redfin water. Like it's, you know, yes, it works here and yes, it works there, but are there certain situations or a situation where you're like, the redfin is the plug for this? Do you have any examples like that?
You know, I mean, it's a plug I throw everywhere, Jerry. I mean, I've caught in so many different conditions. It's just a plug that I have a lot of confidence in. Yeah, I mean, light and variable winds with a little bit of white water breaking over a reef. You know, it could be an offshore reef, or as you know, like in Narragansett and Beavertail and Newport, you're fishing a lot like right up against the edge of the cliff face, which is where, you know, on nights it's flat ass calm. The only place you have any kind of water is right next to the rocks. And it will catch in that kind of environment. The biggest thing with our structure like that is rod angle, because you know, the traditional way of surf casting, you know, you get the rod in between your legs and it's up at almost 11 or 10 o'clock, and when those fish are right below you or very close to you, by then your plug's not even swimming anymore if your rod is at that angle. So I'm always like, starts out that way, and then I drop my rod down almost pointing to the water sometimes to get that thing to swim close. I just have a lot of confidence in that lure, and it's usually number one or number two out of the bag every night that I go fishing, or every day.
So you just got to something really important, actually, that I want to make sure we get to. How are you retrieving this? Are you retrieving it slow, medium, fast? I'm assuming you're not doing it fast, but maybe you are sometimes. Are you giving it any action? Is it a straight? You know, you just talked about keeping the rod tip low when you're fishing it close like that. That's a great tip. But what about your retrieve and sort of your presentation?
Straight and slow. Slow. I may speed it up once in a while if the fish are acting weird, you know, to elicit a strike, you know, a reaction strike. Uh, you know, there's not enough that can be said about like having a background in largemouth bass fishing, which I was able to do, and knowing, you know, I mean, it's so much been written about largemouth bass fishing and how bass relate to structure, and how bass relate to changes in the action of something, you know. So you get some bass fishermen are speeding things up, slowing it down. But I mean, there are times when you need to do that to elicit strikes. And but for the most part, I am basically casting out and reeling it in pretty slow.
Okay.
Very, very slow at times, because that's what they want. You play around with it, but slow to mostly slow.
Have you ever been in a redfin blitz? Like daytime or nighttime, but really I'm more talking about daytime, like where fish are like going nuts and the redfin ends up being the thing. Has that ever happened to you?
You know what? I don't think so that was the only plug that had fish, not necessarily like blitzing where they're cartwheeling all over the place, because, you know, when that's happening, it's whatever's on my line that's catching fish.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen a condition where, you know, bass are basically committing suicide, where redfins were the only thing catching. I mean, I'm sure there are instances of it, but where they have shined is after dark, in structure, where where it's hard to present anything else, maybe but a live eel in the same kind of structure. And um, but you can snake a redfin through some really craggy stuff, um, and and it proves that the fish are there. I
Mm.
mean, I've got a little story about, my friend Zeke who found a black redfin on Block Island. We had never seen like a solid red black fin. I mean, a solid black redfin, and and he found one, and he's shaking it around, and he goes, "Oh, this has not got water in it. This feels different." And sure enough, it was mercury, and we nicknamed that plug the toxic plug. And he, like on that trip to Block Island, after he found that plug, I mean, he just completely schooled all of us with that stupid thing. On flat, calm nights, dead low in boulder fields, he'd cast that, Zeke fished, a big 10.5 foot lammy with an Ambassador 7000. He was a conventional guy.
Mhm.
And he would just kind of just crawl that thing along, and they just blow up on it on the quietest of nights, with no surf and dead low water. And we're all around and playing around with everything that we've got, other redfin colors, and that black one was just like, long story short, that plug was lost by Steve or Campo or one of his friends, because it was one that Steve had made, had loaded, and he either lost it himself or he farmed it out to, one of his crew, and they lost it. He goes, "Let me take. Can you see any yellow between the lip and the body?" And I said, and I scraped away a little bit because Zeke had repainted it. And sure enough, it was marked,
No
and he
kidding.
knew it was his then.
That's great. That's great. Do you
I know.
do
Yeah.
you, do you this is going back to color for a second, but the blurple for me is such a powerful plug. Do you use that color a fair amount, or do you prefer just black?
I did for a while when they first came out with that color. I mean, because again, black was not a stock color that we could ever get.
Right.
And when they went smooth, they started to release black, and then black and purple. Yeah, and I did use black and purple, and I did just as good with that pattern as I did with straight black. I can't say that there was a difference because I just used those interchangeably. Whatever came out of the container into my bag, that was the one I had. I just considered them both the same color.
Interesting.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question now as we're getting to the end here. I'm going to ask you a question now that's going to be a hard one, and I'm going to try and force you to answer, but you might not want to. If you had to replace the redfin with something else, is there something you would replace it with? Is there something close? If you had to.
Yeah, I mean that's tough. I mean, there's you know what? At least nowadays there's so many options. Back in the day, uh, we didn't have many options.
No,
I
there was
mean,
nothing. Right.
and it made things a lot easier for surfcasters. I mean, I think that's part of the issue nowadays. You were saying it's not quite as popular anymore. Well, it's not the niche plug anymore. There are I don't know how surfcasters do it now. I mean, there is so much out there.
Yes, there
And,
certainly is.
I mean, you can spend thousands and thousands of dollars. But, I mean, what's close is an SP, but I'm not real sold on their whole hook hanger system. But I have to say, I haven't tried any of the larger SPs yet. Um, but the smaller one, which is like 6 inches, it's kind of in between the small I mean, the 5.5 inch redfin and the stock 7 inch redfin, but it casts like a bomb. I mean,
Mhm.
and you can play around with it. It works really well with one treble hook. I mean, that would be something that it would have to fill that niche. It does tend to go sometimes a little deeper than I want it.
Yeah.
But uh, and I'm sure there are other plastic, minnow swimmers out there that I can't,
Yeah, I was just curious. Yeah,
bombers are out there, bombers are one of those plugs I never really used a whole lot of until, unless somebody was really hitting them on bombers,
Yeah.
and
yeah.
then I always had a few. So,
I was just interested to see if there was anything. So that was a good
Yeah,
answer.
I mean, Jerry and I have kind of talked about it. The one that's of the modern plastic plugs that's kind of gotten in that same fishing range as the redfin has been the Yozuri Hydro Minnow, the Longcast Hydro Minnow, which that has a lot of the properties swimming wise I've found as the redfin depth. Not so much. I don't know if I've really compared it to swimming action so much, but it's really filled in my bag a lot of the redfin slots, and it casts a lot better out of the box too. So that's one might be worth taking.
I was going to bring that up when we stopped the recording.
yeah. I mean, it's
Yeah.
funny you mentioned that hydro minnow because I've not used them yet. And my partner who was out on Block Island was fishing with me for a couple of the nights out there. And that was one plug that he was using on a night I was using a black redfin. He was catching on the hydro minnow.
Yeah.
I asked him, I said, what is that? And he goes, oh, it's a hydro minnow. I said, I mean, I've heard of them, but I hadn't, I mean, I don't like to buy a lot of lures anymore because I have so many. But there's another one. I may have to pick up one, because I do have my weaknesses. When somebody's with me and they're catching and like
You don't have it,
that might be an option,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely worth playing. I mean, I had them for a while and didn't fish them for a couple of seasons, then started playing around them, and they've cycled. And I've mentioned it a couple of times, with Jerry and I think I might even have finally convinced him to play around with them.
This is my first year using them. Yeah.
It's no magic plug like anything else, but it's in that same realm. That if you're gonna throw the red fin, this is another consideration. Somewhat. There's a lot of parallels between the two, but
yeah, and then most of your plastics are, your hard plastics are, fairly affordable.
Yeah.
It's not like dropping a lot of money.
Not like the redfin though. I think the redfin is
Well,
still
no,
practically
no,
half the
redfin-
price. I mean, you got to put hooks on it, but it's like half the price still practically.
you're still under $10 for a redfin with upgraded hooks.
Yeah. That's great.
Well, this has been interesting. A couple points we didn't quite get to, but maybe we'll have you on again down the road. But before we close this out, want to talk. We'll kind of circle it back. You were talking in the beginning of the recording here that you just came in from fishing off of Block basically for a week. We're recording here at the beginning of November. Going to come out shortly after. When's your season done? You still plan on getting out? You kind of taper it off? How are you looking at for the next couple of weeks before you finally hang it up and you go full couch potato for the winter?
Well, this time of year, I mean, I love it once we get daylight savings time. Basically, because I can start, I'm out at dark, it's 5 o'clock. And I can fish for 3 hours and be home to watch a ball game or a hockey game. I mean, I'm fortunate because I live right here in Newport. My waters are like 10 minutes away. I can give it an honest effort and still be in and sit down with the wife and for a couple hours and it's nice. I really will fish here in our area as long as it lasts or it gets too friggin' cold, and it's been so mild.
Very
But
nice.
I'll fish till about Thanksgiving in Newport. I think the latest I've ever taken a fish in Newport in the open surf is December 6th. But when it gets that late, I mean, I'm looking for, a night when my hands are not freezing. I'll go out for a couple hours. But I'm not into that realm now anymore where I burn the midnight oil. I'll give it till then. I generally don't chase winter overfish anymore. There was years when I just wanted to get the pangs out, and go and catch something. But no, I'll definitely be giving it until about Thanksgiving week, and especially if there's bait still around, because this time of year I pound the same spots all the time, and one night they're there, 3 nights they're not. Then you get another night they're there. I mean, fish are on the move.
Mm-hmm.
Like Charlie Soares says, fish have tails and they swim.
That's right.
And that's a really good little kind of thing to live with, because fish move around.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dennis, for coming on. I also hope to be out there, actually, maybe after Thanksgiving, but we'll see. Thanks so much for coming on. Thanks so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge. This will not be the last time we have you on, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we encourage everyone to check out Dennis's books, and they're very memorable titles. They're so hard to remember, Fishing Around the Block and Fishing Around the Block 2. We'll have those in the show notes. They're excellent, like we said. Thank you so much, Dennis, for talking to us about the red fin. And Toby, I'll let you kick it over.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It's good. I love these talks we've had, Dennis, whether, again, it's talking Block Island, talking the needlefish. I mean, again, we get a bunch of stuff we didn't get to. We could have gone on for this for another hour or two easily. So I appreciate you taking the time today, and we'll certainly have you on again. So definitely thanks for taking the time out with us.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to talk to you guys, and I'm just glad that we can maybe enlighten some of the younger casters out there about what's going on and some of the history of our great sport.
Yeah, thanks. This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast Podcast. You can find out more about the podcast at surfcastpodcast.com, or definitely check us out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, @the Surfcast Podcast.